In late 2024 and early 2025, as winter tightened its grip on eastern Ukraine, Russian armored convoys continued to move under the cover of snow, fog, and poor visibility, conditions once considered favorable for ground operations. On paper, bad weather slows detection, limits air activity, and creates space for maneuver. On the battlefield, it no longer does. Footage emerging from the front shows columns advancing cautiously along frozen roads, only to be struck moments later from above, without warning, without direct contact, and often without time to react. What was once a moment of transition has become a moment of exposure. This report examines how modern warfare is reshaping the meaning of movement itself, and why the act of advancing may now be the most dangerous decision a force can make. To understand why motion has become so lethal, we must first look at how Ukraine has learned to hunt not positions, but movement itself. For decades, bad weather was a shield for moving forces, because snow, fog, and low visibility slowed detection, limited air activity, and gave armored convoys a narrow but real window to relocate without being seen. On paper, winter roads and thick mist reduced the risk of ambush, especially from the air. And many Russian movements in late 2024 and early 2025 still followed that logic. Columns advanced slowly across frozen terrain, engines muted by snowbanks, believing nature itself was masking their presence. What they encountered instead was a battlefield where weather no longer blinded the hunter, but hid the prey in plain sight. Ukrainian FPV drone teams learned to operate inside these conditions rather than wait for them to clear, turning poor visibility into a tactical advantage of their own. Snow reduced background contrast, making moving vehicles stand out more clearly from above, while fog limited what crews inside armored vehicles could see beyond a few dozen meters. FPV drones, flying low and fast, did not need wide visibility or long tracking time, because a brief visual confirmation during movement was enough to begin an attack sequence. In multiple recorded engagements, drones appeared suddenly through mist, locked onto moving targets within seconds, and struck before crews fully understood they were being watched. This shift matters because weather once slowed the pace of aerial warfare. But modern UAV systems are built to work in short detection cycles rather than extended observation. High-resolution cameras, stable digital links, and real-time video feeds allow operators to guide drones using partial images instead of clear skies. A convoy no longer has to be fully visible to be vulnerable. It only has to move at the wrong moment. Snow-covered roads and fog-filled valleys have become predictable corridors where movement patterns are easier to anticipate and easier to intercept. The most important change is not technological alone, but behavioral, because Ukrainian forces no longer wait for Russian units to halt, deploy, or take defensive positions. Attacks now occur while vehicles are still in transit, when crews are focused on navigation, spacing, and terrain rather than immediate threats. Movement itself has become the trigger, and the act of advancing is treated as a signal rather than a necessity. In several engagements documented during winter operations, FPV drones struck vehicles that were neither firing nor unloading, but simply relocating between positions, proving that the moment of transition is now the moment of highest risk. Historically, armored Doctrine relied on motion to reduce vulnerability, since a moving target was harder to hit and less predictable, especially in low visibility. FPV drones reverse that logic entirely because movement creates heat signatures, sound patterns, and visual cues that static positions do not. Even at low speeds, tracked vehicles leave marks in snow that guide operators toward them, while exhaust plumes briefly cut through fog, offering just enough information to confirm direction and speed. These small details, invisible to crews inside the vehicles, are fully visible to operators watching from above. Another key factor is endurance, because FPV drones do not need to attack immediately after launch. Operators can loiter at low altitude, waiting for vehicles to enter narrow stretches of road, bridges, or forest edges where turning or reversing is difficult. This patience allows Ukrainian units to strike when escape options are limited, turning geography and weather into force multipliers. A convoy that once believed it was hidden by fog may already be surrounded by sensors that never lost sight of it. The result is a battlefield where there is no safe window for movement, only varying degrees of exposure, and winter conditions no longer reduce danger but reshape it. Russian units that rely on weather to mask relocation are discovering that concealment without control of the air offers only a false sense of security. Snow and fog no longer protect, they delay awareness, and that delay is often fatal when drones are already in position. Once movement is exposed, the next question becomes which targets matter most when a convoy is finally found. The most damaging strikes on this battlefield are not aimed at the biggest machines, but at the vehicles that keep everything else alive, because Ukraine has learned that cutting the flow of ammunition is faster and more decisive than chasing armored symbols one by one. In many recorded engagements, FPV drones ignore tanks moving at the edge of a column and instead lock onto trucks carrying shells, infantry fighting vehicles loaded with supplies, or armored personnel carriers transporting both troops and rounds. These targets may look less impressive, but they hold the battlefield together, and once they are gone, the rest of the force begins to fail on its own. This focus reflects a clear understanding of how modern ground combat works, because armored units do not fight alone and cannot operate without a steady supply of ammunition, fuel, and replacement crews. A tank with no shells is just heavy metal, and an IFV without resupply becomes a moving shelter rather than a weapon. By striking supply vehicles early, Ukrainian drone teams remove the ability of Russian units to sustain contact, even if those units still have intact armor nearby. The goal is not to destroy everything, but to stop everything from working. On the ground, the effects appear quickly and often without warning. Infantry units that expect fresh ammunition within minutes suddenly find that resupply never arrives, while crews inside APCs realize too late that the vehicle behind them was carrying the rounds they needed to continue the advance. In several winter engagements, Russian formations were forced to halt, not because they faced heavy resistance, but because their magazines were running dry. The pause itself becomes dangerous, as stationary units are easier to observe and easier to strike again. From a tactical view, attacking logistics creates a chain reaction that spreads beyond the original hit. When a single ammunition carrier is destroyed, nearby vehicles must change routes, slow down, or wait for alternatives, which increases congestion and confusion. That disruption creates new targets and extends exposure time, allowing Ukrainian operators to guide follow-up drones toward fresh opportunities. A single successful strike can therefore freeze an entire movement corridor for hours, even if only one vehicle was lost. This approach also explains why isolated tank kills, while dramatic, are often less important than cutting supply lines. A tank can be replaced, repaired, or bypassed, but a broken resupply system affects every unit in the area at once. Ukrainian forces appear to treat logistics vehicles as pressure points rather than targets of convenience, selecting moments when their loss will cause the greatest operational damage. The emphasis is not on spectacle, but on outcome, and the outcome is measured in stalled advances rather than destroyed hulls. Evidence from the field shows that many Russian attacks collapse after initial contact, not due to overwhelming fire, but because units cannot maintain the tempo needed to push forward. Without enough rounds, infantry cannot suppress defenses, and armored vehicles cannot support movement. Commanders are then faced with a hard choice: either pause and risk further losses, or withdraw and regroup. In both cases, momentum is lost, and momentum is often the most valuable asset in an offensive operation. This pattern has repeated across different regions and weather conditions, suggesting it is not an isolated tactic, but a deliberate strategy. By draining ammunition before decisive contact, Ukrainian forces reshape the fight before it fully begins. Advances are stopped early, positions are held with fewer resources, and defensive lines gain time to adapt. The battlefield shifts from a contest of strength to a contest of supply, and in that contest, smaller, cheaper systems can produce outsized results. These strikes are not random hits, but part of a method that repeats with alarming consistency. What makes Ukrainian FPV drone attacks so effective is not a single strike, but a layered process that unfolds step by step, leaving crews with almost no chance to react once they are identified. This is not improvisation in the moment, but a repeatable method that turns small drones into a coordinated system, one that mirrors modern military thinking while using far simpler tools. Each stage builds on the last, and once the chain begins, breaking it becomes extremely difficult. The first layer is reconnaissance, where the goal is not immediate destruction, but confirmation and timing. Surveillance drones scan roads, tree lines, and staging areas, watching for movement patterns rather than fixed positions. Operators look for vehicles that are changing speed, adjusting formation, or entering narrow terrain where escape options are limited. This stage may last minutes or hours, but it sets the conditions for everything that follows. By the time an FPV drone is launched, the target has already been studied, tracked, and selected for vulnerability rather than visibility. The second layer begins when the first FPV drone is committed, and its role is not to destroy the vehicle outright, but to take away its ability to move. Operators aim for engines, tracks, wheels, or suspension components depending on the platform. Even a partial hit is often enough, because a disabled vehicle forces the entire column to slow, stop, or bunch together. In winter terrain, a single immobilized IFV or APC can block a narrow road completely, turning mobility into a liability instead of an advantage. Once movement is lost, the situation changes instantly for the crew inside. A vehicle that cannot reposition is no longer a fighting platform, but a fixed target, and this is where the third layer comes into play. Follow-up drones are then guided toward weak points, such as ammunition compartments, turret rings, or troop sections, areas known to cause catastrophic damage when struck. These final attacks are not rushed, because time now favors the operator rather than the target. The crew has limited options, limited vision, and almost no ability to escape under pressure. This layered approach dramatically reduces the chances of survival, because it removes every decision a crew might normally rely on. Driving away is no longer possible, returning fire is ineffective against fast-moving drones, and abandoning the vehicle exposes soldiers to open terrain under observation. In several documented cases, crews remained inside until the final strike, not because they failed to act, but because no safe alternative remained. The sequence itself creates a trap, and once entered, it closes quickly. The structure of this method closely resembles the kill chain used in Western military doctrine, often described as find, fix, and finish. The difference is scale rather than logic. Instead of aircraft, satellites, and artillery working across different units, Ukrainian operators compress the entire process into a single team using commercial technology. Detection, targeting, and destruction happen within minutes, sometimes seconds, and the cost of each step is a fraction of what traditional systems require. This comparison matters because it shows that the core principles of modern warfare have not changed, but the barriers to applying them have collapsed. Precision, coordination, and timing were once the domain of large, well-funded militaries, but FPV drones allow smaller forces to apply the same logic at the tactical level. A few operators with stable communication links can achieve effects that previously required battalions and air support. The psychological impact of this method is also significant, because crews quickly learn that surviving the first hit does not mean the threat is over. Instead, it signals the beginning of a process designed to end in destruction. This knowledge shapes behavior, slows advances, and increases hesitation even before contact is made. Fear is no longer tied to a single explosion, but to the certainty that more will follow. Faced with these losses, Russian forces have attempted to adapt, but adaptation has proven costly. When losses mounted, Russian forces did not remain passive because the scale of damage forced them to search for ways to reduce exposure, limit manpower risk, and keep supplies moving under constant aerial pressure. One of the most visible responses was the growing use of ground-based unmanned vehicles, or UGVs, designed to transport ammunition, evacuate supplies, and in some cases provide basic fire support. On paper, replacing soldiers with machines seemed like a logical answer to a battlefield dominated by drones. In practice, these platforms entered a fight they were never designed to survive. Most Russian UGVs move slowly, follow predictable routes, and lack active defenses, which makes them easy to track from above. Unlike manned vehicles, they cannot react to sudden threats, change direction quickly, or make tactical decisions under pressure. Once spotted by aerial surveillance, they become isolated targets, and a single FPV drone is often enough to destroy both the vehicle and the supplies it carries. Instead of reducing losses, these systems often concentrate them, because their destruction removes equipment and ammunition at the same time. Footage from the field shows how quickly these platforms are identified and eliminated. UGVs attempting to move through open ground or along forest edges are tracked from launch to impact, with operators adjusting course as needed. Their small size does not protect them, because thermal signatures, movement patterns, and predictable timing all work against them. In several documented cases, a UGV never reached its destination, turning what was meant to be a safe resupply effort into a visible failure. At the same time, Russian units continued to rely on traditional methods of concealment, believing terrain and weather could still provide cover. Forest lines, snow-covered fields, fog, and artificial smoke screens were used to hide movement and protect vehicles from detection. These techniques had worked in earlier conflicts, where limited sensors and slower response times created gaps in observation. On today's battlefield, those gaps no longer exist. Modern UAVs do not need perfect visibility because they can wait. Operators are no longer forced to act immediately after launch, and drones can remain in the air or on standby until a target reveals itself. A vehicle hidden by fog is not invisible. It is simply delayed, and once it moves, the cover disappears. Snow that once masked tracks now highlights them, and smoke that once blocked sightlines often signals activity rather than conceals it. The ability to loiter has quietly reshaped the balance between movement and concealment. FPV drones can hover at low altitude, follow expected routes, or remain parked near key corridors, ready to launch when motion occurs. This patience defeats traditional camouflage because hiding only works when the observer is temporary. When observation is constant, concealment becomes a short-term illusion rather than protection. Statistics from recent operations underline this problem. A significant share of vehicle losses recorded during winter months occurred not during large assaults, but during attempts to relocate or resupply under cover of poor weather. These losses were often concentrated in narrow terrain, where limited routes forced predictable movement, making ambush easier rather than harder. The environment that once reduced risk now channels it. The deeper issue is not the failure of a single tool, but the limits of adaptation without doctrinal change. Deploying UGVs and relying on camouflage treats drones as a temporary threat rather than a permanent feature of warfare. Without control of the airspace, even at low altitude, ground-based solutions remain exposed. Technology alone cannot compensate for a lack of situational awareness, and each failed adjustment further drains resources. As frontline adaptation stalls, the battlefield itself begins to expand beyond the front. The most important change in recent months is not how drones strike, but how far their reach now extends, because Ukrainian UAV operations no longer stop at the front line and increasingly target the spaces just behind it. What was once considered a relatively safe rear zone has become an active hunting ground, where vehicles, supply points, and movement routes are attacked before they ever reach combat positions. This expansion has altered the rhythm of Russian operations, forcing units to fight logistical battles long before they face enemy troops. Ukrainian drone teams now focus on depth strikes that disrupt movement at its earliest stage. Instead of waiting for columns to form near the front, operators track vehicles leaving depots, staging areas, and road junctions that connect rear zones to forward units. When these routes are hit, entire formations are delayed or broken apart, and commanders lose the ability to synchronize assaults. In several documented cases, vehicles were destroyed kilometers from the line of contact, turning planned offensives into stalled convoys without firing a single shot. This shift creates pressure that spreads across the battlefield. A unit delayed in the rear arrives late or understrength, while the units ahead wait for support that never comes. Supply points meant to sustain operations for days are suddenly exposed, and their destruction forces Russian forces to reroute through longer, riskier paths. Each adjustment increases travel time, fuel use, and vulnerability, compounding losses even when no direct engagement occurs. At the same time, the battlefield is no longer defined only by what drones destroy, but by how both sides learn to counter them. Video evidence shows Ukrainian soldiers spotting FPV drones that had been placed on the ground in ambush positions, waiting in low power mode for vehicles to pass. Instead of panicking or rushing forward, troops move cautiously, dismount, and clear the area using basic weapons. These moments matter because they show that UAVs are no longer an invisible threat, but a known danger that can be managed with awareness and discipline. This adaptation signals a broader shift in the drone war. Early in the conflict, UAVs operated with near freedom, striking targets that had little understanding of the threat. Now, both sides are learning, adjusting, and testing each other's limits. Drones still dominate the airspace, but their success increasingly depends on skill, timing, and coordination rather than surprise alone. A single mistake, such as launching too early or approaching from a predictable angle, can lead to failure. The end of safe rear areas also changes how soldiers experience the war. There is no longer a clear boundary between frontline danger and rear security, because observation and attack extend across depth. Vehicles move with caution even far from contact, and every stop carries risk. This constant pressure wears down crews mentally, slows decision-making, and reduces confidence in routes that were once routine. From a strategic view, this expansion favors the side that can sustain persistent observation and adapt quickly. Ukraine's ability to combine surveillance, strike drones, and ground awareness creates a flexible system that can shift focus as conditions change. When a route becomes too risky, operators adjust, searching for alternatives rather than forcing the issue. This flexibility is difficult to counter with static defenses or fixed plans. The most telling sign of this phase is that success is no longer measured only by destroyed vehicles, but by disrupted timelines. Offensives are delayed, resupply is fragmented, and coordination breaks down before contact. The fight is decided in stages, far from the trenches, through pressure applied across space, rather than massed fire at a single point. Taken together, these developments point to a larger shift in how wars are decided. What these months of footage show is a clear shift in how wars are now decided, because advantage no longer comes from how many armored vehicles a force owns, but from how well it controls the space above and around them. Russian units still field tanks, IFVs, and large formations. Yet again and again, those assets fail to reach decisive contact because supply lines are cut, movement is exposed, and rear areas are no longer safe. Step by step, FPV drones have turned armor into a burden and logistics into a liability, leaving Russian advances stalled before they can fully form. For American viewers, this raises a serious question about future doctrine, because armies built for speed and mass may struggle in a fight where visibility is constant and disruption comes first. Ukraine's battlefield has become a warning, not just for Moscow, but for anyone watching closely. If you want to keep following how modern warfare is changing in real time, make sure to subscribe to Military Force, where we break down the battles, the weapons, and the strategy shaping today's conflicts.